I have a daughter with another woman, and when it's being taught in school that, that's just the norm, that it's just mom and dad, it kind of offends us.
A couple of universities are using trigger warnings for Romeo and Juliet, where they say, trigger warning, suicide content.
Dr. Phil McGraw, the iconic television personality famous for his no-nonsense approach to life's toughest issues, has recently turned his attention to what he perceives as a growing threat to free speech and common sense in America: the rise of woke culture. For years, Dr. Phil has been the guy who brings people together, encouraging dialogue and understanding even between the most polarizing of viewpoints. But now it seems he's had enough of just moderating the conversation. He's stepping up to lead it, and he's not pulling any punches. In an era where open dialogue and the exchange of ideas should be at an all-time high, Dr. Phil argues that the opposite is happening. Instead of encouraging discussion, he believes that woke culture is shutting it down. The term woke originally started as a call for awareness around social justice issues, especially regarding racial inequality. It was about being conscious of the injustices that exist in society and striving to make the world a better, more inclusive place. But somewhere along the way, that noble goal took a turn. Today, woke has become synonymous with a rigid set of social and political beliefs that, according to critics like Dr. Phil, demand strict adherence. If you dare to question or deviate from these beliefs, you're not just wrong, you're dangerous. You're a threat that needs to be silenced, and that's where the problem lies. Dr. Phil is concerned that what began as a movement for awareness and inclusion has morphed into something much more controlling and punitive. When you put out an idea that conflicts with the woke agenda, you're not just facing disagreement, you're risking your reputation, your career, and even your personal safety. According to Dr. Phil, this isn't just stifling free speech, it's creating a culture of fear where people are too afraid to speak their minds. And for a country that prides itself on freedom of expression, that's a dangerous path to tread.
Talk about whatever you want to talk about and have an exchange of ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Good luck with that. It doesn't work that way.
One of Dr. Phil's biggest concerns is how woke culture goes beyond simple disagreement to actively punish those who hold differing opinions. He recounts the extreme hostility that people face when they say something that goes against the woke narrative. You see somebody that says something on Twitter or in an interview that is offensive to some group, Dr. Phil explains, and all of a sudden you start reading the messages they get. It's like, I hope you get ass cancer and die, you son of a... The sheer vitriol in these reactions is shocking, and Dr. Phil is deeply disturbed by how normalized this kind of behavior has become. What's even more troubling to him is the hypocrisy of it all. Woke culture claims to be about tolerance and inclusivity, but in practice, it often exhibits the exact opposite. It's intolerant of any view that doesn't align perfectly with its own, and it's quick to label anyone who disagrees as a bigot, a misogynist, or worse. This isn't just a difference of opinion, it's a form of social control that Dr. Phil finds deeply concerning. The idea that people should be afraid to express their thoughts for fear of being attacked or ostracized runs counter to the very principles of a free society. In Dr. Phil's view, it's one thing to advocate for change and progress, but it's another to force everyone to conform to a single way of thinking. This kind of ideological rigidity, he argues, doesn't just limit freedom of speech, it undermines the diversity of thought that is supposed to be at the heart of democratic society. Dr. Phil points to the recent movement to censor everyday terms like mom and dad as an example of how far this culture has gone. These are words that, for most people, are deeply ingrained in their understanding of family. They're universal, almost sacred terms that describe the most fundamental relationships in our lives. Yet in today's woke culture, even these words have become controversial. On his show, Dr. Phil invited a lesbian couple to discuss their discomfort with the terms mom and dad. The couple explained that these words don't reflect their family structure and that teaching children that mom and dad is the norm marginalizes families like theirs.
I have a daughter with another woman, and when it's being taught in school that, that's just the norm, that it's just mom and dad, it kind of offends us. We are lesbians, you know what I mean? We come from the community, and it makes us feel like we're not important enough to be called mom or parents.
They suggested that using a more neutral term like parents would be more inclusive. Dr. Phil listened, but he was clearly puzzled. He understands the desire for inclusivity, but he questions why the experiences of the majority, those who grew up with a mom and dad, should be erased or altered to accommodate every possible scenario. This is where Dr. Phil sees woke culture going off the rails. It's one thing to recognize and respect different family structures, but it's another to demand that society as a whole change its language and norms to avoid offending anyone. For Dr. Phil, the insistence on using a term like parents instead of mom and dad is emblematic of a broader trend in woke culture, the demand that everyone else change to make a small group feel more comfortable. It's a shift that he finds both confusing and troubling, especially when it seems to fly in the face of common sense and shared reality. But beyond the specific examples, what really concerns Dr. Phil is the broader implications of this trend. He believes that woke culture is creating an environment where people are increasingly afraid to speak their minds, lest they offend someone and face the wrath of the online mob. This, he argues, is not just stifling free speech, it's eroding the very foundations of a free and open society. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of woke culture, in Dr. Phil's view, is the rise of cancel culture. Cancel culture takes the principles of woke ideology and weaponizes them. It's not just about disagreeing with someone or calling them out for bad behavior. It's about completely erasing them. When someone is canceled, they're not just criticized, they're cut off. Their career, reputation, and social standing can be destroyed overnight, often without any chance for redemption. For Dr. Phil, this is deeply disturbing. Cancel culture, he argues, is a form of social control that goes far beyond mere disagreement. It's about silencing those who don't conform to the prevailing ideology, often with devastating consequences for the individuals involved. The fear of being canceled is so pervasive that many people choose to stay silent rather than risk saying something that could be interpreted as offensive. This, according to Dr. Phil, is the antithesis of what a free society should be. In a healthy democracy, people should feel free to express their opinions without fear of retribution.
In any way you can, you're free to do so. But that does not mean that the rest of us have to join that illusion. You disagree, I disagree with you, and so you call it hate.
Disagreement and debate are supposed to be part of the process, but when cancel culture takes over, the space for open dialogue disappears. Instead of talking things out and finding common ground, people retreat into their own echo chambers, afraid to engage with anyone who doesn't share their views. So what's the alternative? Dr. Phil offers a different approach, one he calls counsel culture. Instead of canceling people for their views, he advocates for sitting down and having a real conversation. Let's sit down and talk about it. He suggests, let me educate you. Maybe you don't understand. Maybe when you do, you won't agree, but let's talk about it. This approach, Phil argues, is not only more productive, but also more in line with the values of a free and open society. It's about engaging with ideas, not shutting them down, about understanding where others are coming from, even if you ultimately disagree with them. Dr. Phil's commitment to open dialogue is nothing new. For years, he's been a strong advocate for bringing people together, even those with starkly different views, to find common ground. According to Dr. Phil, if we were to sit down and talk honestly about our shared goals, like making America a global leader in education, technology, and more, we might discover that we agree on more than we think. The problem, as he sees it, is that the loudest voices in the room often drown out this potential for unity. These voices, which Dr. Phil identifies as the fringe elements of woke culture, are less interested in finding common ground and more focused on pushing their own agenda, often at the expense of reason and reality.
Everybody would agree we want America to be the number one country in the world. We want to be the leading superpower, the leading educational power, and get back to the core values that they really hold near and dear and not give too much attention to the loudest voice.
Dr. Phil is particularly concerned about how woke culture is impacting the younger generation. He points to the increasing use of trigger warnings on college campuses as an example of how this culture is coddling students rather than preparing them for the real world. Trigger warnings, originally intended to alert individuals to potentially distressing content, are now being used for everything from classic literature to school plays. Dr. Phil finds this trend deeply troubling. I saw a couple of universities are using trigger warnings for Romeo and Juliet. Phil says incredulously, trigger warning, suicide content. Well, spoiler alert.
Search trigger warnings, and you will find that the vast majority, overwhelming body of literature says trigger warnings not only don't work,
make you weaker.
A couple of universities are using trigger warnings for Romeo and Juliet, where they say, trigger warning, suicide content.
For Dr. Phil, the problem with trigger warnings is that they don't actually help students. In fact, they may do more harm than good. He cites research showing that trigger warnings can actually increase anxiety rather than alleviate it. Research trigger warnings, Phil advises, and you will find that the vast majority, overwhelming body of literature says trigger warnings not only don't work, they make you weaker. They actually make you anxious. They actually create the problem that they were designed to avoid. So why, Dr. Phil asks, are universities still pushing trigger warnings even when the research shows they don't work? His answer is blunt. It's all about virtue signaling. Institutions want to appear sensitive and caring, even if their actions are counterproductive. If I can look that up and find it, Phil argues, so can every university that's employing them. So why are they doing it anyway? Because they're virtue signaling. They're wanting to seem like, I am super woke here. I'm really sensitive. I'm protecting all of the students and creating a safe place for them to get an education. But that's not what real education is about. In the end, Dr. Phil's critique of woke culture is about more than just defending free speech. It's about defending the very foundations of a free and open society. He's calling on Americans to push back against a culture that he believes is stifling debate, eroding free speech, and undermining the values that have made America a beacon of freedom and democracy. Whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying that Dr. Phil is pushing a conversation that many people believe is long overdue. And in a world where the loudest voices often drown out reason and common sense, that's a conversation worth having. Dr. Phil's message is simple. We need to return to common sense and logic. We need to stop letting the loudest, most extreme voices dictate the conversation. Instead of rewriting history, science, or even the basic structures of language, we should focus on what's real and what's true. And most importantly, we should remember that just because someone disagrees with us, it doesn't make them our enemies. Dr. Phil might be one of the most well-known advocates for communication, but when it comes to the woke agenda, even he's struggling to keep the conversation going. But if there's one thing we can count on, it's that he won't stop trying. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of persistence we need to navigate these turbulent times.